Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story name: Frozen Faces. It was an ordinary night when Lana stepped into the town of Frey Hollow, seeking refuge from the cold. The storm that had been chasing her down for miles had finally caught up, and the dense fog made it impossible to see the road clearly. Her car's engine sputtered before it died altogether, leaving her stranded at the mercy of the relentless weather. She hadn't expected to find anything resembling civilization in this isolated stretch of land, but when she spotted the dim lights of an old inn through the mist, a sense of relief washed over her. Her phone had no signal, and the highway seemed deserted for miles. This place, though old and weather-beaten, was her only hope. Lana pulled up to the building, a small, run-down inn named the Frozen Rose Inn. A faded wooden sign creaked in the wind, and the windows were clouded with age. She wasn't sure if it was the cold or the eeriness of the place, but something about the inn made her hesitate. Still, with the storm worsening and no other option, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warm air of the inn hit her like a wave, but there was something off about it, a damp, musty odor that stung her nose. Her eyes adjusted to the dim interior, where the walls were lined with old paintings of solemn faces. The reception desk was empty, and no one was in sight, but Lana couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her footsteps echoed as she crossed the threshold, the creaking floorboards the only sound in the vast, cavernous lobby. A bell rang out behind her, and a woman appeared from the shadows. She was tall and thin, dressed in a simple black dress, her face hidden beneath a heavy veil. The woman's steps were soft, as though she floated across the floor, and her presence seemed to fill the room without saying a word. "I'm afraid we don't get many guests this time of year," the woman said, her voice soft and distant, as though rehearsed. "But you're welcome to stay the night." Lana nodded, too tired to argue. "I'd appreciate that. The storm, it's getting worse." The woman nodded in response, her movements slow but graceful. She handed Lana a key, and without saying another word, she led her to a room on the second floor. The hallway was long and narrow, the walls adorned with more of those strange paintings, portraits of people she didn't recognize, all staring out at her with unnervingly lifelike eyes. Lana tried to ignore the discomfort creeping up her spine and followed the woman to her room. When the door opened, a gust of cold air swept into the room. It wasn't the same warmth that greeted her when she entered the inn. It felt like the chill of a tomb, an unnerving draft that seeped from somewhere deep within the walls. The room was small, furnished with an antique bed, a dark wood dresser, and a single window that looked out onto the misty forest beyond. There was something peculiar about the window. A thin layer of frost had already formed on the glass, even though the inn's heating system seemed to be running. The woman paused at the door, her face obscured by the veil, and for a moment, Lana thought she saw her eyes flicker with something unreadable. "You should sleep. The storm will pass by morning," she said, her voice oddly serene. Lana nodded again, too weary to question her any further. "Thank you." With a final, lingering glance, the woman closed the door softly behind her, leaving Lana alone in the dimly lit room. The flickering lamp beside the bed cast long shadows that danced across the walls, stretching and twisting like strange figures. Lana rubbed her eyes, but the fatigue that weighed her down made it impossible to stay awake much longer. She climbed into bed, but no matter how much she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was the quiet, the thick silence that pressed against her like a heavy blanket. And the paintings, those faces watching her. The stillness of it all felt wrong, unnerving. Sleep eventually claimed her, but not before a fleeting, unsettling thought crossed her mind. The faces in the paintings had moved. She awoke in the middle of the night, her heart pounding. It wasn't the storm that had stirred her. It was a strange sound, a faint scratching at the door. She lay still for a moment, listening, but the sound didn't come again. With trembling hands, she reached for the lamp beside the bed, but before she could turn it on, there was a sharp knock at the door. Her pulse quickened. Who could it be at this hour? The woman who had led her here was nowhere in sight. Lana swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her feet meeting the cold floor. She crept cautiously toward the door, her breath shallow as she reached for the knob. The scratching sound had stopped, replaced by an almost suffocating silence. She hesitated for a moment before opening the door slightly, her heart racing in her chest. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, the dim light from the distant end of the corridor barely illuminating the space. Her nerves were on edge, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had changed since she had fallen asleep. The faces in the paintings, the ones she had glimpsed earlier, seemed to have shifted. Their eyes, once staring blankly ahead, now seemed to follow her every movement. She closed the door slowly and locked it, her mind racing. But as she turned to return to the bed, a faint voice reached her ears, a whisper as soft as a breeze. "Lana?" She spun around, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. But there was no one there. The room was still, save for the soft, persistent sound of the wind howling outside. "Lana," the voice whispered again, this time closer, right behind her. Frozen, Lana turned toward the sound, her breath caught in her throat. There, in the dim light of the room, stood a figure, a woman draped in a black veil, just like the one who had welcomed her earlier. But there was something wrong with her face. It was frozen. A mask of terror, frozen in a permanent, agonizing expression. The woman's eyes were wide, filled with a look of dread that seemed to pierce through Lana. Who are you?" Lana gasped, taking a step back, but the figure didn't move. It remained perfectly still, staring at her with those wide, glassy eyes. Then, as if responding to some unspoken cue, the room seemed to grow colder. The frost on the window began to spread, creeping across the glass like an icy hand. Lana's heart pounded in her chest as the temperature dropped to an unbearable chill. Her breath fogged in front of her, and she shivered uncontrollably. The woman's frozen face seemed to crack, a faint smile curling at the edges of her lips. "You should never have stayed here," the woman's voice hissed, her words thick with sorrow. Suddenly, the room erupted in noise, the sound of creaking floorboards, the scraping of chairs, the distant sound of whispers growing louder, as though 1,000 voices were speaking at once, all around her. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thick with malevolent energy. The paintings, those eyes, were no longer staring at her from the walls. They were moving, shifting, their frozen gazes fixed upon her. Lana's pulse raced as the woman took a step forward, her face cracking further, revealing something hideous beneath. The face of a person who had been frozen in terror, their features distorted beyond recognition. Lana turned and bolted for the door, her heart pounding as her mind screamed for escape. But before she could reach the doorknob, the room seemed to close in on her. The walls pressed against her, the air heavy, suffocating. She spun around, desperate for a way out, but the figure was there, blocking her path. And that's when she saw it. The door she hadn't noticed before, hidden in the far corner of the room, covered by the same layers of frost that coated everything else. It was an exit, but Lana didn't know if it would lead her to safety or deeper into whatever nightmare she had just stumbled into. The woman's voice whispered once more, its tone a hollow, aching plea, "Don't look back." But it was too late. Lana had already opened the door. And as she stepped through, the world seemed to twist, the room collapsing in on itself, the faces from the paintings flooding the hallway, their eyes wide, their mouths frozen in silent screams. The tension and atmosphere of the story build with the introduction of eerie, supernatural elements, and the horror escalates as Lana's perception of reality starts to unravel. The cliffhanger ending leaves the audience wondering what lies beyond the mysterious door and whether Lana will escape or fall deeper into the terrifying world of the inn. Lana's breath was coming in rapid gasps now, her lungs burning with the cold air that seemed to choke her as she stepped toward the door. The woman's warning echoed in her mind, "Don't look back." But something compelled her to turn, just for a fleeting moment, to glance back at the room she was leaving behind. The woman, no, the thing that had once been a woman, stood frozen, her cracked face still locked in that grotesque, agonized smile. The shadows in the room seemed to coil around her, and Lana could see them, faintly, as they shifted beneath the woman's outstretched arms. It was as though the darkness itself was alive, swirling around her like a cloak made of shadows. The eyes of the woman, if that's what she even was, seemed to glisten, unnaturally dark, and they fixated on Lana with an intensity that nearly made her stumble backward. There was something wrong with those eyes, something that sent a ripple of pure terror through her veins. They weren't just eyes, they were wells of darkness, sucking in all the light around them, leaving behind an emptiness that felt suffocating, endless. Lana jerked her gaze away, desperately focusing on the door, her mind screaming at her to just leave. But even as she reached for the doorknob, the room behind her seemed to twist, as though reality itself was unraveling. The walls stretched, their faces, those horrible, frozen faces, seemed to shift again, their features growing more grotesque, their smiles widening into grotesque, inhuman grins. A horrible screeching sound filled the room, the walls groaning and bending as if they were being contorted by an invisible force. Lana's heart pounded painfully in her chest, her whole body vibrating with dread, as though the very foundation of the building was about to collapse under the weight of what was inside it. But the door she had just opened, remained solid, unmoving. The light from the hallway flickered and buzzed, casting erratic shadows that danced across the doorframe like wraiths, as though the door was holding something back, something terrible. "Don't look back," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't the woman's voice. It was a chorus of soft, pleading whispers, as if 100 voices were speaking to her from all directions. Some were begging, some were warning her, and others were simply crying, their voices filled with pain and anguish. Lana couldn't make sense of the voices. They all seemed to overlap, their words jumbled and distorted, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. It was terror, the kind of terror that gripped your very soul and made your body freeze in place. With a trembling hand, Lana yanked the door open fully, the harsh sound of the door scraping against the wooden frame filling the air, like the final exhale of a dying thing. She stepped through, and the moment she did, the room behind her seemed to close, collapsing in on itself, the door slamming shut with an unnatural force that made the whole building shudder. For a moment, everything was still. Lana's breath was the only sound she could hear, the pounding of her heart hammering in her ears as she stood in the narrow hallway. The walls here were just as old, just as faded, but there was no sound of the whispers, no sound of the sinister growling. Just the faint flickering of the lights and the oppressive quiet that surrounded her. But even in the silence, Lana could feel it. Something watching her, something lurking just out of sight. The coldness that had crept into her room had now spread throughout the entire hallway. It wasn't just a chill from the storm outside. It was a presence, a cold, unnatural presence that made her skin crawl. Suddenly, the floor beneath her seemed to creak, and the faintest whisper brushed against her ear. Go to. It was softer this time, but it was clear. It was a command, not a warning. Lana spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but once again, there was no one there. No figure. No shadow. Just the lingering feeling that something was closing in on her, that something was behind her, just out of her reach. She didn't want to stay. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape this place and never look back. But the hallway stretched endlessly in front of her, dimly lit, the light from the far end casting long shadows that seemed to flicker unnaturally. It was as though the hallway was endless, as though the walls themselves were pulling her deeper into this cursed place. Then she saw it. At the far end of the hall was a door, just like the one she had come through. But this one was different. The door seemed wrong. It wasn't old or weathered like the others. It wasn't covered in layers of dust. No, this door was fresh. Its paint still gleamed a sickly shade of green, and the edges were clean, as though it had been installed just moments ago. And something was moving behind it. She couldn't see it directly, but she could feel it. There was a weight to the air, a pressure that intensified the closer she got to the door. Her feet moved almost of their own accord, drawn to it, as though the very room were pulling her forward. As Lana approached the door, the whispers grew louder again. She could hear them clearly now, not just from behind her, not just from the shadows, but from the door itself. Help us. Don't open it. It's too late. She reached out for the doorknob, but as her fingers brushed against it, a sudden, deafening crack echoed through the hallway. Lana jumped back, her heart slamming against her ribcage as the lights flickered violently. And then the door moved. It creaked open just a crack, the darkness beyond spilling into the hallway like ink spilling from a bottle, thick and suffocating. The whispers became a roar, a cacophony of tortured voices screaming in agony, clawing at her from the other side. The sound was so loud, so overwhelming, that Lana felt her knees weaken, her vision beginning to blur. The darkness beyond the door seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and Lana could feel something alive moving within it, shifting, crawling. Her legs felt weak, and for a moment, she wanted to turn and run. But she couldn't. As if on instinct, she stepped closer, her body moving against her will, drawn toward the door and the terrible force beyond it. Just as she was about to reach for the door again, the lights above her flickered one last time and then went out completely, plunging the hallway into total darkness. Her heart raced in her chest, but her hand shot out, grabbing for the knob. But just before she touched it, She felt a hand on her shoulder. The grip was icy cold, sending a jolt of terror through her. "You shouldn't have come here." Lana spun around, but the hallway behind her was empty, the silence deafening. And then, with a sickening twist of reality, the door at the end of the hall slammed open, and the darkness poured out, engulfing everything in its path.
If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.